I'm going to start the introduction of our next speaker, Roland Griffiths, the principal investigator of the Johns Hopkins Psilocybin study. The work at Johns Hopkins has been seminal all the way back. They were the last research project pretty much standing at the end of it was the 70s actually by then, and did the most sophisticated work and attracted the most accomplished professionals. And it's not quite like that anymore because things are so methodologically impeccable everywhere you look at all the different research projects. But the Johns Hopkins project has the broadest research program and has done extraordinary work and groundbreaking work in areas of mysticism or mystical type experiences that are not medical even. So it's my pleasure really to introduce you to the gentleman who started that program, and there's another person here speaking today named Bob Jesse, who was instrumental in starting that program up as well, in approaching Roland with Bill Richards and getting the Johns Hopkins study initiated. And Roland, to his credit, who was a senior person in the field of drug policy research, neurochemistry, psychopharmacology, adopted the program with vigor and has become a stalwart, a spearhead for what psychedelics research is accomplishing today. So I'm going to read you Roland's biography. Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurosciences at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. His principal research focus is both the clinical and the preclinical laboratories has been on the behavioral and subjective effects of mood-altering drugs. His research has been largely supported by grants from the National Institute of Health and is the author of over 360 journal articles and book chapters. You can imagine what an incredible asset Roland is to the psychedelic research community. He's been a consultant to the National Institutes of Health and to numerous pharmaceutical companies in the development of new psychotropic drugs. He's also currently a member of the expert advisory panel on drug dependence for the World Health Organization. He's conducted extensive research with sedative, hypnotics, caffeine, and novel mood-altering drugs. In 1999, he initiated a research program at Johns Hopkins investigating the effects of the classic hallucinogen psilocybin. That includes studies of psilocybin-occasioned mystical-type experiences in healthy volunteers, psilocybin-facilitated treatment of psychological distress in cancer patients, psilocybin-facilitated treatment of cigarette smoking cessation, psilocybin effects in beginning and long-term meditators, and psilocybin effects in religious leaders, a study that cooperated with the NYU program. The Hopkins Laboratory has also conducted a recent series of internet survey studies characterizing the effects of hallucinogen occasioned mystical experiences, challenging experiences, and effects on substance abuse. I give you Roland Griffiths.
And thank you to the organizers of Horizons. I did speak at Horizons maybe 6 or 8 years ago, and the conference has certainly blossomed. So today what I want to do is talk about psilocybin occasion mystical type experiences. This is a progress report from the Psilocybin Research Project at Johns Hopkins. And I'm going to talk about the implications for spirituality, altruism, and therapeutics going forward. I just want to acknowledge that support has been provided by various private sector groups. I want to mention the Hefter Research Institute and Council on Spiritual Practices in particular. We also have had some funding from National Institute on Drug Abuse, and I'm on the board of directors of Hefter. So the research that I'm going to discuss with you today has been conducted at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I just want to acknowledge the fact that I'm just a figurehead for a very talented and dedicated research team with whom I'm working on these studies. So we started the research project in 1999, as Neil just mentioned. We initiated the development of our first study in healthy volunteers, and we have completed our ongoing studies in healthy volunteers, novice and long-term meditators, religious professionals, that is clergy, psychologically distressed cancer patients, and addicted cigarette smokers. To date, we have treated about 270 volunteers over 560 psilocybin sessions, so we've accumulated a good bit of experience with psilocybin. For the presentation today, what I want to do is talk about the healthy volunteer studies, and then briefly talk about the novice and long-term meditator study, and then I'll go into some survey studies that we've done that resonate with and are relevant to the whole concept of transformative experience coming through these mystical type experiences. Then I'll end with some therapeutic studies. So this winds the clock back about 15 years ago. We initiated, our first study was published in 2006. What I'm doing here is just going to summarize the results of our first two studies in healthy volunteers, and I've collapsed the results and description of methods just to make it easier, and the results are very convergent. So one study was 36 participants. We compared psilocybin and methylphenidate. Another study was a dose effect study. There we go. Participants were recruited from the local community. They're medically and psychiatrically healthy, and importantly in this study, they're without histories of prior psychedelic or use, or psychedelic or hallucinogen use. Participants in these two studies totaled 54, mean age of 46, about half female, highly educated, most were employed full-time or part-time. So these were high-functioning folks. They met with our session guides or our sitters for about 8 hours prior to the first session, and then they would meet after sessions as well for integration sessions. And the purpose of this is just to develop a rapport with the volunteers, which is really thought to reduce the probability of difficult experiences. People come into our unit. Our session room is a living room-like-esque room. They come in in the morning, take a capsule at 9 o'clock, and they're in the presence of two of our session monitors or guides, if you will. And the volunteers are encouraged to lay on the couch, use eye shades and headphones through which they listen to a program of music. They're invited to direct their attention inward on their inner experience. And so we're not interacting with them except on an as-needed basis. If fear or anxiety emerge, then the sitters are there to provide reassurance. So this shows the time course of dose effect studies, and these are monitor ratings across a 6-hour period of the session. And you can see they're just very orderly dose and time-related effects, with effects peaking at 2 to 3 hours. And not surprisingly, if you give questionnaires to try to get to the qualitative features of what the experience was like, we see that these high doses of psilocybin produce effects similar to those produced by classic psychedelic drugs. So there are perceptual changes, greater emotionality, sometimes fear, anxiety, and cognitive changes. But what I want to focus in on today is this, that for most volunteers, psilocybin produced large increases in self-rated questionnaires that were designed to measure naturally occurring mystical type experiences. So these were, one of the classic questionnaires in the field was developed solely on the basis of descriptions of mystical experiences that occur so-called spontaneously. And this shows some dose effect data on this mystical experience questionnaire showing robust dose-related increases. This is immediately post-session. So what's a mystical experience? So there are these phenomenological dimensions of mystical experiences that were originally described very nicely by Stace in the 1960s, and they include this sense of unity that's a core feature of this, the interconnectedness of all people and things, all is one, pure consciousness. And that's accompanied by a sense of sacredness, a noetic sense of encountering ultimate reality. It's more real than real. Deeply felt positive mood, universal joy, peace, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability. These experiences are said to be indescribable. We have since gone back and factor analyzed that scale. That's a fancy term that people who develop questionnaires use to see if there are different factor structures or different sections or qualities of the mystical experience. In fact, there turn out to be four. Their unity, sacredness, and noetic fall into something we call a mystical factor, and then these are independent factors: the mood, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability. So we actually have a good psychometric measure for assessing these. So psilocybin, of course, is relatively short-acting, so it's largely gone by the end of the day. But here's what was so compelling to me when we started this, and that is the memories of these experiences and the attributions that people are making to these experiences months afterwards. So this is 1 month after our high-dose sessions. This is in our dose effect study. And we have here about 80 to 90% saying it's among the 5 most personally meaningful or spiritually significant experiences of their lives. They're comparing it, say, to the birth of a firstborn child. Increased sense of well-being, life satisfaction. 90% are saying increased positive mood. And in addition, there are positive dose-related shifts on things like positive attitudes about life itself, mood changes, spirituality and altruism, and positive social effects. And so in the spirit of focusing in on the spirituality for this purpose, this shows dose-related increases in spirituality. And this is the kind of thing that people are endorsing. They're saying that they have increased reverence, increased sacredness of life, gratitude for life, interconnectedness of all of life, prayer, increased prayer and meditation, increased personal relationship with God of their understanding, decreased apprehension about death. And this shows the kind of, again, dose-related effects to the altruism or positive social effects. And here people are endorsing increased sensitivity, tolerance, and love of others, concern, increased concern and compassion in the social context, concern for vulnerable people, need for service for others, decreased hatred or negative expression of anger. And these effects, I just showed you effects at 1 month, these effects are sustained, and all of the positive effects are sustained at 14-month follow-up. We've not gone further. We suspect it's far longer than this. But this is just illustrative. This is 5 weeks after 20 or 30 milligrams of psilocybin, so 94% are endorsing increased well-being, and here's, I can't read it here, 14 months after the session, it's almost the same. Now these effects aren't just observations made by the participant themselves, they're also shown in ratings provided by community observers. These would be friends, family members, colleagues at work. And if you do interviews with them that tap into these same dimensions of claimed changes, you see significant elevations. Final point I want to make in this healthy volunteer group is that the mystical type experience immediately after the session is measured, immediately after the session, predicts, in this case, spiritual significance at 14 months follow-up. It also predicts a variety of other positive effects, as I'll show you. But this is a mysticism scale score, so the higher the score here, the more mystical, according to this questionnaire, the effects were. And this is showing ratings of spiritual significance over a year later at 14 months. So there's something predictive about what people are going to say over a year from now that's tapped into by this mystical experience. construct. And it's not simply the intensity of the psilocybin experience. You can see there's no relationship with intensity. So that's why we're zeroing in on the mystical experience. Okay, changing gears now. Psilocybin and meditation. So we think that psilocybin and meditation can be viewed as complementary techniques for exploration of the nature of self, the nature of mind. And their neuroimaging studies and meditation studies, or neuroimaging studies, have shown that both meditation and psilocybin produce similar effects on brain networks responsible for self-referential processing. This is the so-called default mode network. So they appear to have some commonality there. But again, it's the interest here is they're both techniques for exploring the nature of mind. So one study that we have completed, it's not published yet, is this study in novice meditators. It's a double-blind study examining whether psilocybin can facilitate people's engagement with meditation and other spiritual practices, and thus increasing spirituality or altruistic kinds of values. 75 participants in this study, little or no history with either meditation or use of classic hallucinogens. This 6-month study began with a month introduction into meditation, followed by 2 psilocybin sessions separated by a month. Participants were randomized into one of 3 different groups. So this is a parallel group design, but participants and staff were blinded to dose and certain conditions of the study. So group 1 received a very low dose of psilocybin and some support, but low support for spiritual practices. Group 2 was identical, except they received high doses of psilocybin on both sessions. And group 3 not only received high dose, but also had high support for spiritual practices. So we met with them many, many more times to encourage meditation and some of these spiritual awareness practices. And this slide just shows, now I'm going to just show you 6-month data. So this is follow-up data at 6 months across these 3 groups, and this is typical of the other outcome measures. So low-dose standard support is here. If you add a high dose of psilocybin, you get a substantial increase, in this case in spirituality at 6 months. And if you add on top of that support for spiritual practices, you get a further increase and a significant increase. And so here's altruism, positive social effect, forgiveness, trait level forgiveness, benevolence, motivation, all showing the same pattern. Interpersonal closeness, daily spiritual practices. So the study then demonstrates enduring positive effects on spirituality and related measures at 6 months. Psilocybin dose is an important determinant of that. That would have followed from our studies in healthy volunteers. High support for spiritual practices further increases the positive effects of the high dose of psilocybin. And a regression analysis shows that both spiritual practices, that is like meditation and mystical experience, make independent contributions to these positive outcomes, with mystical experience producing a substantially greater contribution. Turning now to an ongoing study we have in psilocybin in long-term meditators. There's very little prior research done with established contemplatives. Of interest here is whether psilocybin produces beneficial or perhaps detrimental effects in people that are so practiced. So the outcome measures include psychological functioning, spirituality, pro-social attitudes, behavior, brain functioning with fMRI, both pre-post psilocybin and during psilocybin experiences. It's a randomized placebo-controlled design, 40 participants, again with substantial meditation experience, but little or no past use of hallucinogens. They received 1 to 3 sessions. During some sessions, they engage in a meditation practice. This is psilocybin versus placebo. This is an interim analysis in our long-term meditators. This is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. And you can see that long-term meditators do what our healthy volunteers do. They're showing large increases in this measure of mystical experience, way over that shown with placebo. And likewise, the attributions made to these experiences are very similar to what we see with the healthy volunteers. So this is spiritually significant, top 10 of lifetime, personally meaningful, top 10 of lifetime, increased life satisfaction, all significantly greater under psilocybin than placebo. But most germane to these practitioners, this is the impact on their meditation and spiritual practices. And so they're claiming positive effects on meditation practice, greater flexibility in how they hold their meditation practice, positive effects on non-sitting awareness practices. So despite decades of contemplative practice, psilocybin produces personally valued experiences along with positive effects on both meditation and daily awareness practices. I might just add as a footnote, although these experiences are highly valued, none of our participants would claim that psilocybin is a substitute for meditation, which results in much greater stability of day-to-day awareness. I now want to turn to a couple of survey studies that again relate to the laboratory data. So we've run several anonymous internet surveys, large groups of individuals reporting their experience after ingestion of psilocybin mushrooms. These actually are quite an undertaking. It takes 30 to 45 minutes to complete these questionnaires. One of these surveys focused on individuals who endorsed having had a profound and personally meaningful experience, 88% of which were also rated as mystical experiences. I might just add Catherine McLean, who will be speaking later today, was intimately involved in this survey. The participants completed the survey on the basis of their single most profound or meaningful personal experience. And so we used this population. We ran a couple different cohorts, and this is one of the bases in which we developed the factor structure for the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. But what I want to show you here is how do these results compare to our laboratory participants? So here we have survey results. This is an N of about 1,600 people. This summarizes laboratory studies, 126 people. So there are demographic differences between these groups. The laboratory studies, laboratory participants tend to be older, about the same ratio of gender. The laboratory participants tend to be better educated and have little to no experience with psychedelics, in contrast to the survey participants who had a fairly significant experience with these drugs. So they're different populations, but here's what I think is the take-home message for us. Here's Mystical Experience Questionnaire scores. The red is laboratory, blue is the non-laboratory, and remember, that's the single most profound or meaningful experience of your lifetime with psilocybin mushrooms, and they're really quite comparable. And when we look at attributions to the experience, again, they're extremely comparable. So the laboratory is looking like an interesting model system for these most profound experiences that people have under non-laboratory conditions. So the conclusions here are that there are marked quantitative and qualitative similarities of enduring effects when you compare laboratory studies of hallucinogen-naive individuals with survey studies of drug-experienced individuals talking about their single most profound or meaningful experience. And this then suggests to us that our screening, preparation, support, and dosing procedures used in the laboratory may be optimizing conditions for producing these deeply meaningful and profound experiences. I want to turn to one other survey. We're just doing the analysis of this, but it relates, and it's been a fascinating question for me. The probe question on the internet advertisement was, have you ever had a personal encounter with God or higher power? And we targeted two groups. Those who had had such an experience after consuming psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybin group, and those who had such an experience in absence of taking a psychoactive drug. And in fact, in this group, if they had had an experience of that sort after a psychedelic, we excluded them from analysis because we wanted these pure experiences of spontaneous reports of God encounters. So respondents in this survey had to endorse having had an experience of encountering something that someone might call God, God of your understanding, higher power, ultimate reality, or an aspect or emissary of God, e.g. an angel. Here are the demographics. So we're comparing almost 1,200 people with psilocybin, 830 in the non-drug spontaneous group. Again, we have significant demographic differences here. The age at time of experience, the non-drug group tends to be older, more female, more highly educated, higher income, and they also are more likely to endorse being a monotheist. Now here's something, this is the descriptor that they said that they encountered. So here what we're showing is that the non-drug group is more likely to be endorsing that they encountered God as a descriptor or an emissary of God. And conversely, the psilocybin group is more likely to endorse having encountered ultimate reality. So differences in demographics, differences in how they describe what it was they encountered. But this I find really interesting. These are the qualitative attributions to that which was encountered. And so they have checklists about, tell me about the nature of this, either ultimate reality or God or whatever. And both groups, very similarly, are saying what I encountered was intelligent, sacred, benevolent, eternal, and conscious. And it was less likely to be malicious or negatively judgmental. And when you look at mystical experience scores, it's very similar. And if you look at attributions to the experience, again, it's very similar in terms of their rating of spiritual significance, meaning, psychological insight, or increased life satisfaction based on that experience. So we conclude from this that it supports the idea that psilocybin occasioned divine experiences, if you will, could represent a model system for understanding non-drug, so-called naturally occurring or spontaneous experiences often described as personal encounters with God. I just want to turn very briefly to therapeutic applications. So we've done 2 different types of therapeutic trials. I don't have time to go into any detail, but I do want to relate this to this theme of mystical experience. So we have looked at cancer patients. These are people with depression or anxiety exacerbated by life-threatening cancer diagnosis, and we see large decreases after a single dose of psilocybin. We've also looked at psilocybin-facilitated treatment of cigarette smoking. In both cases, post-session mystical experience scores predict subsequent therapeutic outcomes. So this is from the cancer trial. This is showing that post-session mystical experience scores as a predictor of therapeutic efficacy. So this is total mystical experience at the end of the session. This is attribution of personal meaning. Again, we're seeing a relationship there, spiritually significant. But here's what's interesting. Decreases in anxiety are greater the higher the mystical experience score, decreases in depression. And likewise, here's from our data at 6-month follow-up from our smoking study. Smoking craving at 6 months is decreased as a function of post-session mystical experience scores. So overall, the under these conditions of these studies, psilocybin occasioned discrete experiences having marked similarities to classic mystical experiences. These experiences are associated with positive, persisting changes in attitudes, moods, behavior, spirituality, and altruism. The finding that psilocybin can occasion in most people study mystical type experiences virtually identical to those that occur naturally suggests that such experiences are biologically normal. That is, such experiences are now amenable to prospective scientific study. And so there are many different directions that research can go, and this is the 10-year future in 20 seconds or less. Now that we can do prospective studies manipulating these deeply meaningful, spiritually significant experiences, we can unpack them. There are targets within the framework of biological psychiatry, like personality genetics, personal intention. Of course, there's a whole array of neuroscience, reductionistic neuroscience questions to be asked about where in brain what circuits are involved. There are behavioral sciences about behavioral mechanisms, and then of course there are these therapeutic applications. Further research is almost certainly going to reveal biological neuroscience and behavioral mechanisms of action of these drugs. I'm absolutely confident of that. And as well, it's very likely that further research is going to result in an array of very interesting therapeutic applications. But I think more importantly is this spirituality, because these mystical type experiences give rise to trait level changes in spirituality, altruism, gratitude, forgiveness, and interpersonal closeness. They actually appear to be foundational to our very deepest sense, our core sense of ethical and moral understanding. It's this pro-social impulse for mutual caretaking. And therefore, further research into the causes and the consequences of these extraordinary experiences may ultimately prove to be crucial to the very survival of our species. Thank you.
Questions, Q&A here?
I'm wondering, in all of the experiments that you've described here, do the subjects go in with any kind of intention before ingesting the psilocybin, and how is the experiment framed? Is it made clear that we're studying mystical experiences, et cetera, before they go into it? So are they framed for that kind of experience ahead of time? Same with tobacco, all of them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the trope, if you will, set and setting is all important here, and so that depends on the different trials that we run. Implicit in our cancer studies, where people are hugely distressed, they're anxious or depressed secondary to a cancer diagnosis, implicit in that is that there's something about this experience that's going to speak to whatever's going on in their life. Likewise, implicit to our cigarette smoking cessation study, and incidentally, I didn't mention it, the quit date coincides with the first psilocybin study in that session. Implicit there, too, is that this is going to be very helpful to them quitting smoking. That study is conducted in the context of behavioral, cognitive behavior therapy. What we don't say is how it's going to, how that's going to come about. And the reason we don't say it is frankly, we don't know. There's something remarkably reorganizational about these experiences. Sometimes that may come in the form of personal insight. Sometimes it may come in the form of this encounter with the deep sacredness and mystery of human consciousness. But there's something very empowering about these experiences. In the meditator study, the novice meditator study, clearly we were interested in supporting their spiritual practices, so that was an implicit bias there. In the healthy volunteers, they were there for curiosity, but most of them had interest in spirituality. So what I'd say is it's really quite variable.
In the first study that you put the slides up on, could you make a comment about the typical physiological and psychological effects of the active placebo that was used? And secondly, on some of those slides on the dose response, you had increases from the 0 milligram dosages on some of the scales, and you have any comments on that?
In several of our studies, we have actually bent over backwards to create conditions that are going to optimize placebo responding, that is, expectation. And some studies, for instance, our cancer study and the novice meditator study, we told people that they were going to receive psilocybin on each session. The dose might vary. What we didn't tell them is that it would either be a trivial dose of psilocybin or a full-out dose of psilocybin. So we were doing our best within the constraints of what we can do ethically and informed consent to maximize placebo effects. And under these conditions, we get just that. We have had very compelling experiences. Even within our meditator protocol, we've had occasions in which people, and this is the long-term meditator, which people received placebo, and they had remarkable effects, so much so that they were convinced they had received a high dose of psilocybin, and they convinced their guides that they had received a high dose of psilocybin. So, but that speaks also to this whole thing about the spontaneously occurring experiences. I mean, this is really part of our biology. These experiences are not limited to drug experiences. So you get the conditions set right. If you're a long-term meditator and you go into a month-long retreat, you may have quite a remarkable experience. But the important point here is that in spite of high placebo effects, we're getting very pronounced dose and time-related effects. So there's no question that pharmacology is active here. In that first study, we used a design, I don't have time to go into the details of it, but we, again, bent over backwards to create a controlled condition, in this case a high dose of methylphenidate, that might be experienced as something really remarkable by people without any prior history of hallucinogen exposure. And so that's what we did. As Rick Doblin pointed out in talking about his FDA trial, there's no perfect control for this. So you can use active controls or you can use some kind of instructional controls.
Can you get a little more detail about your delivery system in your actual testing labs, as far as, are you doing concentrates, are you doing alcohol extracts, are you just taking the mushroom, grinding it, putting it in a capsule and giving it to them, because it actually has different effects on your delivery.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're using synthesized psilocybin, and as Rick mentioned, Dave Nichols was responsible for synthesizing his MDMA. Dave was also responsible for synthesizing our psilocybin. So it's measured out, it's given on a weight basis, so we know we're giving pure compound. And one of the studies that we long to do is to compare directly the effects of synthesized psilocybin with mushrooms, but so far we haven't received funding for anything like that.
The people with cancer, I'm wondering how ill were they? Were they very close to dying? And if so, did they have a physical response, nausea, or anything to the psilocybin?
Yeah, thank you for that. So Steve Ross is speaking after me. His trial is very similar to ours, and I think he'll probably go into more detail on that. These were individuals with life-threatening cancer diagnosis. Most were metastatic. People had to be physically healthy enough to come into our laboratory for screening and for the sessions, so they weren't end of life, last week of palliative care. We wondered, is this the right thing to do with someone who's already physically degraded and emotionally upset? And I think all I can tell you is the profile of adverse effects in the cancer patients was really no different than that in healthy volunteers or smokers or any other populations, albeit that some of the cancer patients were really struggling with chronic pain conditions and other kinds of physical discomforts. But there was no indication that those effects were, or those kind of symptoms were exacerbated by psilocybin per se.
Yeah, my question was, you touched a little bit on the neuroscience of these studies. Do you have any idea as to what neural pathways are affected, as in like what regions of the brain are lighting up, or you're not quite that far along yet?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we have ongoing studies with fMRI, and the London group, Carhart Harris and David Nutt, have done substantially more imaging work than we have. The best story we can tell out of those studies to date are that there do seem to be decreases in network connectivity amongst different modes of the so-called default mode network. And that network of brain function is thought to underlie ego, if you will, self-referential processing. And that seems to be, at least under acute psilocybin condition, to be taken offline. And it's a great story, because that's how we would describe this. These are compounds that will, under appropriate conditions, release someone from those egoic constraints. And the interesting thing about those observations that the Imperial group in London made is they converge very nicely with Judd Brewer's work in long-term meditators, that also shows that during meditation, in which self-referential processing and ego is set aside, you see decreases in those same networks. But I guess what I really want to say is consciousness is bafflingly complex. I mean, we don't have an explanation for why we're conscious. And there are theories, but there are emergent network functions, and this is a active area of research. It's not likely to be broken in the near future at all. So the level of complexity of what we're dealing with when we're talking about the fact that we're aware, that we're conscious of this experience, is just phenomenal. So there's going to be no easy and quick answer to that question.
I think our time is up right now. Please help me thank Roland Griffiths from the Johns Hopkins Project.
Adonis. Go ahead.